Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back John Harwood and his distinguished panel.
I'm back again. How was lunch? Good. Well, we have a terrific panel to talk about what is possible and achievable with respect to economic growth. Let me just start. My immediate left, Jason Furman, who was the last chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. We've got Josh Bolten, who was budget director and White House chief of staff for President George W. Bush and is now the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable. And we've got Mitch Landrieu, who is the mayor of New Orleans, tells me he's not running for president.
I'm not either.
Which is rare among Democrats. And I have to get one conflict of interest out of the way. My daughter is a constituent of his in New Orleans and works at a hip-hop dance nonprofit that the mayor's office has supported. So I'm just getting that out.
There you go. Glad we cleared that conflict of interest up.
Exactly.
A couple of others we could talk about, but.
Jason, let me start with you. We are very focused in thinking about the economy and what will make the economy grow on what Washington does. What does it matter and how much of a contribution is made by what Rahm Emanuel does in Chicago, what Mitch Landrieu does in New Orleans, what governors do outside of Washington?
I think a very big contribution. I'd also add the businesses that are the members of Josh Bolten's organization. I think we often tend to overrate what federal policy can do. And that's true on both sides. The people that advocate for policies say they'll get us to 3%, 4%, 5% growth. The people that hate policies say they'll drive us directly, into a recession. And when you look at most public policies that we can do at a federal level, maybe you can add, 1, 2, 3 tenths to the growth rate. Maybe if you do something stupid, you'll subtract a couple tenths from the growth rate, but they tend to be less dramatic than people often say.
And therefore, the contribution of other factors is greater.
Look at something two things that are big problems for our economy right now. One is excessive occupational licensing. You need a license to be a florist or an interior designer. Those licenses differ from state to state, so you can't move from one state to another. Or land use restrictions that take some of our most productive, attractive cities, make it hard to build in them, drive up the cost, and people can't move to them. Both of those inhibit the type of fluidity and dynamism that we need to have a successful economy. Both of those are state and local policies. There's very little the federal government can do about either of them.
Well, I remember the very fevered debate between Clinton and Trump last fall over occupational licensing and land use proposals.
I was at a wedding during the second debate, so I assumed it happened there.
Yeah. Josh Bolten, let me ask you, one of the things that we talked about this morning with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin was the potential for the economy accelerating its growth rate. And we've seen the mainstream economists project that little above 2%, little below 2%, somewhere right around there. How possible do you believe it is to get to the 3% growth target that the administration has talked about?
I don't know. It seems like a bit of a stretch. Jason reminded me that that when I was the budget director, Jason, what were the numbers?
You had 3 budgets you presided over, and relative to the blue chip, one of them you forecast the same growth rate. One you forecast growth rate 1/10 below the blue chip. One was 2/10 below the blue chip.
And what about yours?
I was 1/10 above once, which was wildly optimistic. The same once, and 1/10 below. Trump is 1 percentage point above. Just nothing resembling anything either of us would have done, or either of the presidents we worked for would have done.
Well, but let me say this also, which is that we were in budget realms where we were not proposing radical changes in government policy, and before we condemn too harshly the 1% growth rate, I don't think we should underestimate the kind of dynamism that can and should be released from fundamental tax reform in this country. I think I'm not in a position to say that it's a percentage point or a half percentage point or whatever, but I think there is enormous potential within the U.S. economy that would be released by tax reform that lowers the corporate rate and shifts to a territorial system of taxation. And from the budgetary standpoint, while I've never been a subscriber to the view that tax cuts pay for themselves, we should never underestimate the kind of potency that growth has on the health of the federal treasury. Every half point of GDP increase, if you realize a half point of GDP increase sustained over a 10-year period on current estimates, that means 1.65 trillion more in federal revenue. So if we can get that half point, or hallelujah, the full point, that means a much healthier treasury than it otherwise might be.
Mr. Mayor, you preside over a city that for more than a decade has been recovering from a catastrophic blow. What do you want from Washington? What do you need from Washington? And what can you do on your own?
Well, first of all, a couple things. These guys know a lot more about fiscal policy than I'll ever learn in my life. But I was a legislator for 16 years and was part of a state budget that sometimes was good and sometimes was bad. I was a lieutenant governor for 6. I served with 5 governors and now have been running the city. And I would say a couple things. First of all, cities are very dynamic organizations. Demographic trends have more people moving into cities now than have ever moved into them, and they're very entrepreneurial, they're very flexible, and contrary to the current political rhetoric about cities are pretty fabulous places. And most of the people in America are either living in, around, or work in cities. And they can do a lot of things on their own. Incidentally, when you guys were talking earlier, when I took over the city of New Orleans, the city had, at that time, a $100 million hole in its budget, which was 22% of our budget. So we cut out 22% of our government in 6 months. Now, you guys are talking in the 1%, 2%. This was a 22% cut. So I know a little bit about slicing and dicing. And we had some really hard decisions we had to make because we knew we had to cut. But that's kind of where the discussion started. It's not where it's ended. It's how you cut that matters. And we chose to cut with a scalpel, and we think smartly as opposed to cutting with a hatchet. You can lose weight by just cutting off your arm, but you're likely to die. So that's not a good way to do it. So
you had a good surgeon.
But we set about in the city of New Orleans trying to get fiscally strong. So we cut pretty aggressively in a very thoughtful way by renegotiating every contracting, reorganizing boards and commissions, consolidating government services, stopping doing things that the city wasn't essentially supposed to do. We also raised revenue, though, and we also generated savings through restructuring. So we kind of took an all-of-the-above approach. And now, 7 years later, we've balanced our budget 7 years in a row. The credit rating has been increased 4 times. It's the highest credit rating that we've had in the history of New Orleans. And it was a non-ideological approach. On the issue that you were talking about earlier, we actually got into how long does it take somebody to get a permit? How easy is it to get land use restrictions lifted? What is really the right thing to do as opposed to the wrong thing, and what are you trying to get to? So debt, for example, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's about how you use it, how you manage it, and whether or not it gets to be an anchor around your neck or something that actually lifts up your ability to do well. So I guess the first thing that we would say is it depends on who's running Washington when we ask the question, what do we need from them? If it's a hostile environment, what we need them to do is not to hurt us. If it's a helpful environment, we need to help them. In rebuilding the city of New Orleans, I would say this, that we're very thankful that the federal government stepped up and was a willing and an aggressive partner through the Bush years and through the Obama years. And the city of New Orleans wouldn't be here if we didn't have our federal partners. But we also had state partners and we also had local partners. And we had an organizational structure that invited in the business community, the faith-based community, and not-for-profit so that everybody was at the table taking responsibility and taking opportunity. And it wasn't an ideological approach. It was a what works, and let's do that, and then we'll label it later.
Let me ask a question related to the hostile environment issue that you raised. Is New Orleans a sanctuary city?
No, it's not a sanctuary city, actually, but we are an open and we're a welcoming city. And so now we've gotten into an argument with the White House and the Department of Homeland Security.
The reason I ask is whatever you call it, are you, by their definition, vulnerable to having federal funds withdrawn?
No, not now that the Attorney General has come to our view of actually how you define this and how you do it smartly and not rhetorically. And so this gets to a bigger issue, which is we wouldn't be having this fight if Congress would actually do comprehensive immigration reform. So mayors across America and governors, by the way, are asking Congress to get to work and solve that. It's a problem. We know what the problem is. We know what's causing the problem. We know what the solutions are. Actually, they've been talked about ad nauseum in this town. And it just seems to me that Congress...
You're talking about the wall.
I think, I'll speak to the issue. I think that there's some consensus that we ought to secure the border. Now, whether you do it with a wall or technology, I think is debatable. I think we've arrived at a conclusion that you're not going to kick the dreamers out. I think we've arrived at a conclusion that you want to go after the bad guys who are killing people and put them away. And I think that we've arrived at the uncomfortable notion that you're not going to deport 11 million people. It seems to me there's a deal there. That shouldn't be hard to get to.
And can I add one thing on that? When we were in the G20 process in Australia, when they had the presidency of the G20, everyone submitted a growth strategy to the G20. And the World Bank, IMF, and OECD evaluated the growth strategies. They came back and said the United States had a strategy to add more growth than any of the other advanced economies, I think than any of the economies that didn't make up their economic data, so we're behind China. The thing that distinguished us from everyone else was immigration reform. That's what they placed the greatest weight on in terms of adding to our economic growth. That's why it's something the BRT has pushed for years, and it doesn't just increase our workforce, deal with the demography that's one of the big obstacles to growth. It also increases our innovativeness, and that's not just high-skilled people. That's the undocumented workers that are already here. Reducing the amount of uncertainty that they face in the economy is another thing that can help our productivity and growth as well. So I think that issue links back to where we were in the beginning.
Josh, I want to ask you a question about your experience in the Bush administration. One of the subtexts or overt texts of this meeting every year and fiscal discussions in Washington are, when is Washington going to do something to restructure, reform, change, cut Medicare and Social Security, which drive so much of the debt? To President Bush's credit, he pursued a partial privatization of Social Security in the teeth of very strong opposition from Democrats. In the end...
And Republicans.
Well, that was my point. In the end, fellow Republicans fled, and it didn't happen. What does that tell you? Does that tell you that that was a high watermark for dealing with those issues, and we're simply not going to change those programs? Or is there some lesson from that fight that you think should guide Democratic or Republican administrations in taking that on?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that the Bush administration's experience with both Medicare and Social Security reform aren't a predictor of the future, because reforming those two programs is the only way we're going to get our budget situation under control. Now, you're talking about 10 plus years ago with the Bush administration efforts, not just on Social Security, but also on Medicare reform. That we had proposals to try to bend the cost curve, as the Obama administration struggled with for many years, and every administration will struggle with, that were rejected bipartisanly. Mm-hmm. We couldn't get either. We couldn't get close to getting Democrats, but we couldn't get Republicans either to support the president on it, which was the nature of our experience on Social Security. President Trump campaigned on not touching those programs. And it probably turned out to be the wise political thing to do. But at some point, hopefully in the not distant future, we need to recognize that there is no solution to our long-term budget challenge unless we dig in on Medicare and Social Security, that is, dig in on reducing the long-term cost of essentially a middle-class benefit. And my hope and expectation is that as we get closer and closer to that demographic point where it really will become unsustainable, and we'll see it in the 2020s for sure, with exploding debt numbers and increased interest costs, that policymakers will come around to some bipartisan consensus that has to be done. We got closer in the Obama administration than we did in the Bush administration with the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which was prepared to dig in on some of those things. I think it would be great to see an effort like that come up again. Not likely to happen certainly in the early years of a Trump administration, but it would be terrific to see a bipartisan effort like that come up again, because one party alone is not going to be able to take on those political hot potatoes.
Jason, when President Trump said don't touch Medicare and Social Security, some in your party, Bernie Sanders among others, said exactly right. That's a place I agree with him on. We do not need to touch them. Are they wrong? And when you look, for example, at Medicare, your administration claimed at least partial success in bending that cost curve on Medicare. Is that all that needs to be done to Medicare, or does more need to be done on that as well as Social Security?
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of the history, we did some pretty large things on Medicare. Some of it was in the ACA, but some of it in legislation in 2015, reforming the way physicians were paid. And that second set of legislation was bipartisan. It used a lot of the same delivery system reforms about paying for quality, integrated care, avoiding duplication that we had done in the ACA, but this one had a Republican stamp, and because of that, you actually saw a couple of years where Medicare spending per capita actually fell, which was dramatic. Going forward, I think there's more scope for savings in Medicare. I don't think there's huge scope, but there's some more. In terms of Social Security, I think if you want to put forward a plan that says we're going to help retirement security and we're going to raise taxes, and here's how we're going to raise taxes, including on the middle class, you're going to pay more in your lifetime and you're going to get more later on, I think that's a perfectly reasonable and coherent thing to propose. I think absent an appetite for higher taxes over the course of your lifetime on the part of middle class families, I think it's much more difficult and incoherent to propose a Social Security increase. I want to come back to what Josh said about Bowles-Simpson. I mean, what I see is two of the core principles in Bowles-Simpson. One was that you were putting revenue and spending on the table, that you're dealing with the deficit with both halves of that. Obviously, this is a budget that goes in the opposite direction. It does it entirely on the spending side, and the spending cuts aren't for deficit reduction. Spending cuts are to pay for tax cuts. So that's one thing, is putting revenue and spending on the table, getting back to that conversation. The second thing that was in Bolten is they didn't have any low-income cuts. They didn't cut SNAP, food stamps. They didn't cut Medicaid. They didn't have these types of low-income cuts. So they went, not at the most vulnerable and the most indefensible, but looking at the types of smart reforms you can do to entitlement. So I think getting back to those types of principles would be the way to move forward in a bipartisan conversation. This budget, of course, is the opposite on both of those.
Josh, on that point, do you agree that a reasonable approach to reforming these programs must include some tax increases?
No, I think Medicare and
I think we have a disagreement.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal that can be done on Medicare and Social Security by advancing retirement ages, by changing cost of living increases.
What about the Bowles-Simpson formula that you mentioned, which did have both?
It did.
In fact, it had much larger tax increases than the Obama administration Republicans later agreed to in the fiscal cliff.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, let the record be clear. The Obama administration rejected the Bowles-Simpson proposal.
Right.
that Jason was just touting.
But
So
we agreed
suggesting.
we agreed with the broad spirit of it. We put forward a plan that had entitlement savings. I mean, we had changed CPI in our budget. We had a cut for current Social Security benefits explicitly proposed by President Obama in his budget. Some people here may not like it. I just heard someone that didn't. But we did that, and we did that not because he loved it, but because he thought that's what we needed to do.
Who hissed about
to get a
change
deal.
CPI? I mean, what kind of crowd are we in here? Where you get hissed for mentioning change CPI, with which, by the way, Jason and I are in violent agreement. No, I don't think you have to contemplate tax increases to get good Social Security and Medicare reform. Now, to get a bipartisan deal of the kind that Simpson and Bowles were ultimately put together, you probably do have to have tax increases to satisfy some Democrats. But the important thing is you got to get both parties at the table. Because,
that's really
neither
what I was
party
asking.
alone.
Because clearly, if Democrats could, or some Democrats could accomplish it by raising taxes, they wouldn't cut benefits. And if Republicans could accomplish it by cutting benefits, they wouldn't raise taxes. But doesn't, by definition, a bipartisan process mean that it must include tax increases?
Yeah, probably. But I thought you were asking the substantive question,
Yeah.
which is, do you have to fix these programs by raising taxes? My answer is no. Do you have to raise taxes in order to get Democrats involved? I would hope not, but the answer is probably yes.
Mr. Mayor, do you have a big problem, as many mayors and governors do, with unfunded liabilities for employee retirement?
Yeah, I mean, just to make an observation about this, I think if you added to the equation, in order to increase military spending by $54 billion and bring the debt down to 10 years, the answer might be a little bit different. From a mayor's perspective, I think if we were solving tough problems, which would be unfunded accrued liabilities, which are gargantuan on the state levels, or a firefighter's pension system that is out of balance, that the only way to do that is to have every possibility on the table as part of a negotiation. You can't ask some people to take a sacrifice and not others. So, for example, on the sensitive issue of Social Security, extending the retirement age, it should be on the table. Taking less benefits in a shorter period of time should be on the table. All of those things are necessary to confect a deal that works. The interesting discussion that you two guys have just really kind of left out, just because the question didn't include it, was if you want to increase military spending and you want to bring down the debt and you want to do both of those things, you can't do it with two hands tied behind your back. And mayors just don't live in that world. We live in real time and we live in reality. And the 3% number on the growth reminds me of something that we had in Louisiana when Governor Edwards was governor, and they didn't want to be fiscally responsible. They created something called a revenue anticipatory note. It was a RAN.
Sounds reasonable.
We anticipate that in 5 years, because of what we do, we will have, and we used to bank off of that. Of course, that thing never came due. And it drove up the.
Could you do it just by writing it on a piece of paper?
Well, that's what 3% is. That's what 4% is. It's called a revenue anticipatory note. I mean, we've tried this before. We've seen this in Louisiana. So I would say that if Washington, and again, I'm just not the right person necessarily to give this advice, but we see this on the local level. I've seen it in my city. Everybody's got to take the pain when you're in hard times, and sacrifice means it hurts. I'll give you a couple of other simple things. Less is less. Less is not more. You can't do more with less. You do less with less. You don't go as many miles when you don't have as much gas in your car. Less is less. And so I come up here and people say the exact opposite of what things mean. But on the ground, like Medicaid, cutting Medicaid is not going to hurt anybody. Because,
this is why he does stand up at the mayor's conference.
Because we're going to give it to the states and they're going to fix it. That's not what happens. If you block grant Medicaid and then you don't create some level of growth, essentially what's going to happen is a governor is going to have to make a decision about whether they're funding health care, whether they're funding education, whether they're funding workforce training, and then somebody's not going to get something. So everybody ought to be talking up here about what happens on the ground when whatever everybody's talking about here actually becomes policy. And then when you see the real human faces, then you can make an easier determination about who gets and who doesn't get. And that seems to me what the discussion up here on the congressional side may be missing, because both of these individuals were involved in helping rebuild New Orleans. And I can just tell you, the biggest bang for the buck, the thing that really produced the greatest economic growth, was infrastructure investment. That was the one thing that produced private sector response quicker than anything else. A quick example, in New Orleans, if you've been downtown, we have a streetcar. We added a streetcar line that went through one of the toughest neighborhoods. We also had HUD funding for some redevelopment of housing, some school funding, et cetera, et cetera. When all of those federal funds hit the ground at once, and this rail car line that we got through a Tiger grant, I think it was $75 million, it produced about $2 billion in private sector investment in this neighborhood right after those things got in. And so essentially what you saw was federal investment from a number of different agencies, all from OMB, essentially. Some through the Tiger grant, and then the not-for-profit, the faith-based community, and then a whole neighborhood standing back up, and people not only have housing, but had a school to go to, had work, and then the private sector came in and dumped a huge amount of investment because they wanted to benefit from the number of people that were now doing well, and it was an all-in strategy, and it worked for us.
What do you think of the Trump proposal to get rid of CDBG?
I think it's insane. Because if you ask yourself a question, you know, what is it you're trying to achieve? For example, on the same day that they said they were going to get rid of CDBG, they said that they were going to increase funding for Veterans Affairs and that they were going to do everything to support veterans. Well, for anybody that followed the initiative that we've done together to get veterans off of the street, we made a commitment to make sure that no veteran would be homeless. They would know that the VASH vouchers in HUD and other housing initiatives in partnership with some funds from the VA, from other departments, actually were all of the parts that allowed us to get veterans off of the streets of America, which we're fairly close to achieving as a nation. And when you peel apart different pots of money that have been used to do that, that are strewn together through different departments, then the outcome goes away. So it just seems to me you should ask yourself, well, what are you hoping to achieve by getting rid of that? And what you're going to do is leave a lot of people on the street. If that's the objective, it's a great idea. If that's not the objective, it's not such a great idea.
Well, I just want to go back to the thing I originally asked you, which is to try to put in New Orleans specific terms how you dealt with the local equivalent of Social Security. How have you dealt with your city employee retirement obligations?
Question. I didn't mean to avoid it. Actually, It's the toughest fight that we had. Now, I'm a Democrat city. What's the worst thing that you can do? Is take on the firefighters union. Nah, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. Okay, but when we got there, what we noticed is there was a 30-year lawsuit that had been going on. I mean, the cost of the pension system for the firefighters was out of control. Nobody, even a friend, the greatest friend of firefighters, which I consider myself to be, although they're mad at me, could look at that system and said it can sustain itself. Here's another thing. Unsustainable means it can't go on. It's not just a word. I mean, eventually you're going to get to, okay, today's the day that it became unsustainable, and then we're going to fall off. Don't go there. So we started really working hard with the firefighters to try to figure out how to get them to take less, how to get them to pay a little bit more, how the city could put more money in it, and then how we could ask the taxpayers to fill the gap. Again, an all-in strategy. And we've now secured that particular pension system. The other pension systems in the city actually are in fairly good shape. They're about 80% to 85% where they need to be. I would say, though, on the state level and municipally around the country, this is a huge problem that we have got to get our handles on, because a lot of these funds are not in a healthy enough point that if people started retiring all at one time, that we could really take care of. But again, you can't do this without getting people to not retire later, or not to take less, or not to pay more, or to get the taxpayers to put in. You just can't. The numbers really don't work. And I would just suggest to people that when we're trying to do things really, really hard, like Social Security, that everybody kind of go back to their corners and get as apolitical as you can, and find a solution that requires everybody to make a little bit of a sacrifice.
Jason, on an economic basis nationally, how big a drag or problem is it that so many states and cities, in addition to the federal Social Security problem and Medicare problem, that there are unfunded pension liabilities for state and municipal workers?
I think, I don't want to get pulled off the stage or anything, so I'll agree that I think the debt is a problem. I think it's a problem at the national level. I think it's a problem at the state and local level.
How come you doubled it?
What?
How come you doubled it in the Obama administration?
It was that little recession thing that just came out of the blue. I won't say inherited on this stage. Wasn't so terrific for that. But and I think though, but I think I agree with the point made earlier. You need economic growth to deal with your debt. You can't deal with it, or not can't deal with it. It'll be a lot harder to deal with if we're growing at 1.8% than if we're growing at, say, 2.3%. I think infrastructure is a big part of that. When we put infrastructure in our budget, we propose to pay for it. And some people would come up to me and say, you know what, it's going to create extra growth and pay for itself. And I would say that would be terrific if that happened, because then our deficit and debt would come down. We'd have the infrastructure, we'd pay for it, and it would come down. If you wanted to do that on taxes, you could do the same thing. Propose something, have it be revenue neutral without the growth, and then all the growth goes to deficit reduction. In this budget, they actually took all the growth and used it twice, once to pay for the tax cuts, once for deficit reduction, and a bit of egregious arithmetic we probably don't want to spend more time on now. So I think some of this is a walk and chew gum type of thing of how can we make the investments. Absolutely, we want lower business tax rates. We want a more competitive international system. But we don't want to solve that problem while making our debt and deficit problem, worse. So I think this is a walk and chew gum type of policy that we need to have here.
Josh, I had a conversation not long ago with somebody who worked on tax and budget issues for Senator McConnell. And we were talking about the potential for some sort of grand bargain down the road, given the fact that the number of baby boomers who are over 65 and on those entitlement programs is going to go up by 50% in the next 10 years or something like that. Maybe not quite 50%. And he said, I'm sad to say, but we will not have the political capacity to act on this, Washington will not, until it is right on top of us, until we get to 2023 or whenever it is that we actually get into the red on reserves are gone. Do you agree with that?
I don't know, but I hope it's not true. I mean, I don't. The crisis gets harder and harder to solve every year we get closer to it. 10 years ago, it was easier to solve than it is today. It'll be much harder to solve 10 years from now. I would just hope that we will find a political moment where Republicans and Democrats can come together and say we have to hold hands on this issue, and probably come up with the kind of bargain that Jason was talking about before the United States becomes uncreditworthy. Now, the United States has survived through a period that I think probably no other nation on earth could survive without becoming uncreditworthy. We've basically doubled our debt to GDP ratio over the last decade, and credit markets have yawned. In fact, we have...
Early in the Obama administration, there were a lot of Republicans saying, they keep these trillion-dollar deficits going, we'll be like Greece. We haven't become like Greece.
Yeah, and I mean, to some of us, it's been something of a surprise. Now, I have to admit, a pleasant surprise, especially if you're working in government at that time. And I'm sure there are a lot of factors that go into it, not least that the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and doesn't appear likely to be challenged for the time being as the world's reserve currency. But at some point that will run out, and my instinct about it is that it's one of those crises that is very slow coming, and then when you get to that point, it happens very quickly. So my hope would be that our political leaders will have the wisdom to address it before we get to that point, because the solution will take time to actually have effect, and the crisis could happen very quickly.
Mr. Mayor, I want to give you the last word on this with a little bit of historical perspective. Your father was a cabinet secretary in the Carter administration when our two parties really didn't look anything like they look now. There was a much higher proportion of conservatives within the Democratic Party, liberals within the Republican Party, which made it more possible than it is now for people to make those bipartisan compromises. There's no going back to that, is there?
I hope so.
How could it happen? Because now we've got, we mentioned three things. We have ideological lines. Democrats are almost uniformly liberal, Republicans uniformly conservative. Those overlap with partisan lines. And more, as our demography changes, add racial lines to that as well. Republicans dominate the white vote, Democrats dominate the non-white vote. Doesn't that preclude the ability of the two parties, absent a crisis, to do anything?
That's only true if you believe that Washington runs everything. If you look at what's happening in cities with mayors and governors, we're much less ideologically bent, and we're much more practical. And there are a lot of solutions on the ground. We would rather Washington be an active and engaged partner at the table, but you're starting to see some really innovative things happening across cities. And I'm hopeful that even on the Washington level, we'll come out of what I hope is just a temporary fever, historically, and get back to where we make some reasonable, thoughtful choices. And I don't want to disagree with Josh. I hope that it doesn't take a catastrophe to solve this problem. It's clearly right in front of you. You can see it. But my experience, unfortunately, has been that unless people are in a near-death experience or in a catastrophic, they will not make huge transformational changes. I wish that would change, because there are some things that we can clearly see in the country that are bothering us. And I think the politics of the moment may preclude us from doing anything, but my hope is that always, a good group of new young folks are going to rise up and do the right thing for the right reason, because, there is a universal love that everybody does have for the country, irrespective of what the ideology is. And I think America's always either, found a way or made one to get where we need to be. I just hope we don't wait until either maybe it's too late or it's too much harder to do than is necessary.
Great panel, huh?
We agree.
We thank them.